blood, and true honor. Magnolia Maggie Callahan had resigned herself to a marriage she didn't want, but just before she could say her vows, Rhett Slade burst into the church, his revolver gleaming under candlelight. He caught her hand, his grip firm. "You were never meant for him, Maggie," he murmured, "and I'll be damned if I let you go now." Chapter 1. The Unwilling Bride's Dawn. The sun, a pale, hesitant disk, was just beginning to crest the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the dusty plains of Abilene. Magnolia Maggie Callahan stood before the warped, age-worn mirror in her childhood bedroom, the reflection staring back at her a stranger in a gown of ivory lace. The fabric, meant to symbolize purity and joy, felt like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. She traced the delicate embroidery with a trembling finger, the intricate patterns mocking the turmoil within her. Today, she was to marry Silas Thornton, the wealthiest rancher in the county, a man twice her age and cold as a winter nor'easter. The marriage was a contract, a merger of lands and legacies, orchestrated by her father with the ruthless efficiency of a cattle auction. Maggie's feelings, her dreams, had been deemed irrelevant, mere trifles in the grand scheme of Callahan ambition. She glanced at the small, framed photograph on her dresser. A younger, carefree Maggie beamed back at her, her arms slung around the shoulders of a laughing, dark-haired young man. Elias. The memory of his warm smile, the feel of his hand in hers, sent a fresh wave of grief washing over her. Elias, her childhood sweetheart, lost to a fever 3 summers past. A loss that had hardened her father and softened her spirit, making her malleable to his plans. A knock on the door, brisk and impatient, shattered the fragile reverie. "Magnolia? It's time." Her father's voice, devoid of any warmth or affection, cut through the quiet of the room. Maggie closed her eyes, drawing a shaky breath. She had rehearsed her lines, practiced the serene smile expected of a blushing bride. But her heart, a captive bird, beat wildly against its cage, desperate for escape. She opened her eyes, meeting her own gaze in the mirror. The woman staring back was no longer the girl in the photograph. This woman was a survivor, hardened by loss and resignation. But beneath the surface, a flicker of defiance remained, a spark that refused to be extinguished. Downstairs, the murmur of gathered guests reached her ears. The scent of beeswax polish and wilting flowers mingled with the heavy aroma of cigar smoke. The parlor, usually a place of warmth and family gatherings, had been transformed into a gilded cage, ready to trap her forever. Her father, Thomas Callahan, stood at the foot of the stairs, his steely gaze assessing her with the cold detachment of a man evaluating livestock. He was a man built like an oak, weathered and unyielding, his face a roadmap of harsh winters and harder bargains. He offered his arm, a gesture of duty, not affection. "You look presentable," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Remember what's at stake, Magnolia. The future of this family rests on this union." Maggie took his arm, the rough fabric of his suit scratching against her gloved hand. She felt like a lamb being led to slaughter, her steps heavy and reluctant. The church, a small, whitewashed building at the edge of town, loomed ahead, its steeple a stark silhouette against the brightening sky. As they walked, she caught glimpses of familiar faces in the crowd. Neighbors, townsfolk, ranchers who had come to witness the joining of 2 powerful families. Faces that blurred into a sea of polite smiles and hushed whispers. She searched for a friendly face, a sign of understanding, but found only polite curiosity. Inside the church, the air was thick with anticipation. The pews were filled, the hushed murmurs a low drone that vibrated through the wooden floor. Silas Thornton stood at the altar, his stiff posture and severe expression radiating the same cold authority as her father. He was a man of sharp angles and hard lines, his face etched with the ruthlessness that had built his empire. The organ began to play, a somber melody that seemed to mourn the loss of her freedom. Maggie focused on the worn planks of the aisle, counting each step, trying to ignore the suffocating weight of expectation that pressed down on her. She reached the altar, her father releasing her arm with a subtle, almost imperceptible shove. Silas offered her a curt nod, his eyes devoid of any warmth or affection. The preacher, a thin, nervous man with a perpetually damp brow, began the ceremony, his voice trembling slightly. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." His words seemed to fade into the background as Maggie's mind drifted, seeking refuge in memories of happier times. She remembered sun-drenched picnics with Elias, whispered promises under a canopy of stars, the innocent joy of a love that had been snatched away too soon. The preacher's voice droned on, weaving a tapestry of words that meant nothing to her. She felt a growing sense of panic, a desperate urge to flee, to escape the suffocating confines of this gilded cage. To join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Maggie's gaze drifted to the stained glass window depicting a scene of angels ascending to heaven. She imagined herself among them, soaring above the dusty plains, free from the constraints of duty and obligation. If any man can show just cause. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the back of the church. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Maggie turned, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a stance that radiated both danger and defiance. He was dressed in the rough attire of a rider, a worn leather duster concealing most of his form, but his eyes, dark and intense, were unmistakable. A revolver gleamed in his hand, its barrel reflecting the candlelight with a menacing glint. The silence in the church was shattered only by the frantic beating of Maggie's own heart. It could be nobody but Rhett Slade. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Sanctuary. The name echoed through the stunned silence of the church, a whispered curse, a prayer of disbelief. Rhett Slade. The outlaw. The ghost. The man who had haunted Maggie's dreams, both waking and sleeping, for years. He was a legend whispered in hushed tones around campfires, a figure of both fear and fascination. And now, he stood here, in the flesh, disrupting the carefully orchestrated charade of her wedding. His presence filled the space, a palpable force that shifted the very air in the sanctuary. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his eyes scanning the room, assessing the threats, the exits, the possibilities. There was a raw, untamed energy about him, a dangerous magnetism that drew Maggie's gaze despite the terror that clawed at her throat. He hadn't aged much, she realized, her mind struggling to reconcile the memory of the boy she had known with the hardened man before her. The years had etched lines around his eyes, a subtle web of experience and hardship, but the intensity of his gaze, the determined set of his jaw, were unchanged. He was still the Rhett Slade who had ridden beside her father, learned the ranching trade alongside her, the boy who had once held her hand and whispered promises of a future that had been cruelly snatched away. "What is the meaning of this?" Silas Thornton's voice, sharp and laced with outrage, cut through the silence. He stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving towards the pistol hidden beneath his coat. Rhett's gaze flickered towards him, a flicker of amusement dancing in his dark eyes. "I believe the preacher asked if anyone had just cause," he said, his voice a low, resonant drawl that sent shivers down Maggie's spine. "And I do." The preacher, pale and trembling, stammered, But who are you?" Rhett's smile was slow, dangerous, a predator baring its teeth. "The name's Slade. Rhett Slade. And I'm here to collect what's mine." His eyes locked with Maggie's, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink, the crowded church fading into a blur. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze, something beyond the bravado and the danger. A hint of vulnerability, perhaps, or a plea for understanding. Her father, his face a mask of fury, pushed his way through the stunned crowd. "Slade, you dare show your face here? After what you did?" Rhett's expression hardened, the amusement vanishing like smoke in the wind. "What I did, Callahan? Or what you made me do?" The unspoken accusation hung in the air, heavy and charged with unspoken history. Maggie felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. She had always known there was more to the story of Rhett's sudden departure, his transformation from trusted ranch hand to notorious outlaw. Her father had always painted him as a thief, a traitor, but there had always been a nagging doubt in her mind, a whisper of something unspoken, something hidden beneath the surface. "Get out of here, Slade," her father growled, his hand tightening into a fist. "This is none of your concern." Rhett ignored him, his gaze never leaving Maggie's. He took a step closer, the distance between them shrinking, the tension in the room growing with each passing second. "Maggie," he said, his voice softer now, a murmur that seemed to reach only her ears. "Do you want this? Do you want to marry this man?" The question hung in the air, a challenge, a plea, a lifeline. Maggie's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and something else. A flicker of hope, perhaps, a desperate yearning for a different path. She looked at Silas, his face contorted with rage, his eyes cold and devoid of any affection. She looked at her father, his expression a mask of implacable control, his grip on her future tightening with every passing second. And then she looked back at Rhett, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity, a promise of something wild and untamed, something terrifying and exhilarating. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, a fragile thread of sound in the charged silence. No, the word hung in the air, a declaration of defiance, a rejection of the carefully constructed prison that had been built around her. It was a whisper that shattered the silence, a spark that ignited a powder keg. Rhett's smile returned, a slow, triumphant curve of his lips. He reached out, his hand extended towards her, a silent invitation, a promise of escape. "Then come with me," he said, his voice low and steady, a beacon in the gathering storm. "You were never meant for him, Maggie. And I'll be damned if I let you go now." He caught her hand, his grip firm, reassuring. The warmth of his touch, the strength of his grip, sent a jolt of electricity through her, a surge of defiance that momentarily banished the fear. Chapter 3. A Bandit's Promise. His grip was a lifeline, a tangible connection to a world beyond the suffocating confines of a church, the preordained future that had been laid out for her like a burial shroud. The warmth of his hand, calloused from years of writing and hardship, was a stark contrast to the cold formality of Silas Thornton's touch, the calculated indifference of her father's. It was a touch that spoke of risk, of danger, but also of a fierce, unwavering loyalty. Silas roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. "You won't get away with this, Slade. I'll see you hang for this." Rhett ignored him, his focus solely on Maggie. He tugged gently on her hand, urging her forward, away from the altar, away from the life that had been chosen for her. She stumbled, her legs unsteady, her mind reeling from the suddenness of it all. The ivory lace of her gown snagged on a pew, a small tear ripping through the delicate fabric, a symbol of the life she was leaving behind. "Hold on tight," Rhett murmured, his voice a low rumble close to her ear. He kept his revolver trained on the crowd, a silent warning to anyone who dared to interfere. Her father, his face a mask of fury and betrayal, lunged forward. "Magnolia, don't be a fool. He's an outlaw, a criminal. He'll ruin you." Maggie hesitated, her father's words echoing the fears that had been instilled in her since childhood. Rhett Slade was a dangerous man, a man who lived outside the law, a man who could offer her nothing but uncertainty and hardship. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something else. A flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the boy she had once known, the boy who had held her hand and whispered promises under the stars. "He's my chance," she whispered, the words barely audible, but firm with a newfound conviction. Rhett squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her trust, a silent promise to protect her. He turned, pulling her with him towards the back of the church, towards the open doorway, towards the blinding sunlight and the promise of freedom. The crowd parted before them, a sea of shocked faces, whispered accusations, and silent judgments. Some looked at her with pity, others with disdain, but Maggie ignored them all. Her focus was on Rhett, on the strength of his hand in hers, on the promise of escape that he offered. As they reached the doorway, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the wooden frame just inches from Rhett's head. He spun around, his revolver firing in response, the deafening sound echoing through the church. The crowd screamed, scattering in panic, the carefully orchestrated ceremony dissolving into chaos. Rhett pushed Maggie behind him, shielding her with his body. "Stay close," he commanded, his voice tight with urgency. He fired again, forcing the shooter, one of Silas Thornton's men, to retreat. Then, he grabbed Maggie's hand again, pulling her out of the church, into the blinding sunlight. 2 horses were tethered outside, their reins tied to a hitching post. Rhett's horse, a magnificent black stallion, pawed the ground impatiently, its nostrils flaring, sensing the urgency of the situation. The other, a smaller, gentler mare, stood quietly beside it. Rhett lifted Maggie onto the mare, his hands strong and sure. "Can you ride?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Maggie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had ridden since she was a child, her father insisting that she learn to handle a horse as well as any man. Rhett swung himself onto the stallion, his movements fluid and effortless. He leaned down, extending his hand to her. "Take my hand," he said, "and don't let go." Maggie reached out, her fingers clasping his. He pulled her close, their bodies brushing against each other, the heat of his presence a tangible force. He spurred his horse, the stallion leaping forward, the mare following close behind. They rode out of town, leaving behind the chaos of the interrupted wedding, the stunned silence of the congregation, the shattered remnants of her former life. The dust billowed behind them, a swirling cloud that obscured the past, leaving only the present, the uncertain future, and the wild, exhilarating sense of freedom. As they galloped across the open plains, the wind whipping through her hair, tearing at the remnants of her bridal veil, Maggie felt a sense of exhilaration she hadn't experienced in years. She was escaping, running, breaking free from the gilded cage that had held her captive for so long. She glanced at Rhett, his profile etched against the vast expanse of the sky, his eyes focused on the horizon. He was a dangerous man, an outlaw, a man who lived by his own rules. But in that moment, he was also her savior, her rescuer, the man who had dared to defy convention, to steal her away from a life she didn't want. He had made a promise, a bandit's promise, and she had chosen to trust him. The consequences of that choice, she knew, would be profound, but for now, all that mattered was the wind in her hair, the pounding of the horse's hooves, and the feeling of his hand, warm and strong, clasped tightly in hers. The vast, open plains stretched out before them, and only the setting sun knew where their journey would end. Chapter 4. Across the barren plains. The miles melted away beneath the horse's hooves, a rhythmic pounding that echoed the frantic beat of Maggie's heart. The town, with its stifling expectations and suffocating social structures, receded into the distance, becoming a mere smudge on the horizon. The vast, unforgiving plains stretched out before them, a seemingly endless expanse of sun-scorched earth and scrub brush, broken only by the occasional towering mesa or dry, winding creek bed. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic breathing of the horses, the creak of leather saddles, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Maggie stole glances at Rhett, his face set in a grim, determined line, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of pursuit. He was a figure of stark contrasts, the outlaw she had been warned about, yet also the boy she had once known, the boy who had held her hand and whispered promises under a canopy of stars. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, to understand the events that had led to his sudden departure, his transformation into a wanted man. But the words caught in her throat, a mixture of fear and uncertainty holding her back. She was acutely aware of the precariousness of her situation, of the fact that she had traded a life of certainty, however undesirable, for a life of complete uncertainty, riding alongside a man who was a stranger and yet intimately familiar. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth and turning the air into a shimmering haze. Maggie's throat was parched, her lips cracked, and her borrowed riding clothes, hastily donned in a back room of the church, offered little protection from the relentless heat. She felt a growing sense of exhaustion, both physical and emotional, the adrenaline that had fueled her escape beginning to wane. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and red, Rhett finally slowed the horses to a walk. He led them towards a small, rocky outcrop, a natural shelter that offered a modicum of protection from the elements. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, and helped Maggie down from her horse. His hands lingered on her waist for a moment longer than necessary, sending a shiver of awareness through her. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from the long ride, and he steadied her with a firm grip. "We'll rest here for the night," he said, his voice low and raspy. "We need to conserve our strength, and the horses need water." He led the horses to a small, steep spring nestled among the rocks, allowing them to drink their fill. Then, he unsaddled them, his movements efficient and practiced, the actions of a man who had spent his life on the open range. Maggie watched him, her mind still struggling to reconcile the two images of Rhett Slade, the trusted ranch hand, the boy she had loved, and the hardened outlaw, the man who had stolen her from her wedding. He built a small fire, using dried brush and twigs he had gathered, the flames flickering to life, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks. The warmth was welcome, chasing away the chill that had begun to creep into the air as the sun descended below the horizon. He offered her a strip of dried beef and a canteen of water, the simple provisions a stark reminder of the life she had chosen, a life far removed from the lavish meals and comfortable surroundings she had known. Maggie ate the jerky slowly, savoring the salty taste, the water soothing her parched throat. She sat beside the fire, watching the flames dance, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, uncertainty, excitement, and a strange, undeniable sense of freedom. "Why did you do it, Rhett?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question that had been burning in her mind since he had burst into the church. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering firelight. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I couldn't let you marry him, Maggie," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "You deserved better."
"But why?"
"You left. You disappeared." "My father said," he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Your father," he said, his voice laced with bitterness, "is a liar and a manipulator. He used me, Maggie. Just like he's using you." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Maggie felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She had always suspected there was more to the story, a hidden truth that her father had kept carefully concealed. "What happened, Rhett?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Tell me the truth." He stared into the fire, his expression grim, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. The silence stretched out, long and tense, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. And then, under the vast, star-studded expanse of the night sky, he began to tell his story, a story of betrayal, injustice, and a love that had been stolen, a story that would forever change the way Maggie saw the world and the man sitting beside her. The vast, empty landscape seemed to listen, holding its breath. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Abilene. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that mirrored the turmoil in Rhett's eyes as he began to unravel the tapestry of his past. The night was still, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, the vastness of the plains a silent witness to his confession. "Your father and we weren't always enemies," Rhett began, his voice low and gravelly, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I came to work for him when I was just a boy, barely 16. He took me in, taught me everything I know about ranching. I looked up to him, Maggie. I respected him." Maggie listened, her heart aching with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She had always sensed a hidden tension between her father and Rhett, a simmering animosity that had never been fully explained. "He trusted me," Rhett continued, his voice tinged with a hint of bitterness. I ran his cattle, managed his hands, even helped him negotiate deals with other ranchers. I was like a son to him, or so I thought. He paused, taking a deep breath, his gaze shifting to Maggie. But then Elias got sick. The fever it took him quickly. Maggie's eyes welled up with tears, the memory of Elias's death still a raw, open wound. She had loved him, with the innocent, passionate love of youth, and his loss had left a void in her heart that had never fully healed. Your father, he changed after that, Rhett said, his voice softening. He became harder, colder, obsessed with expanding his empire, with securing his legacy. He saw Silas Thornton's land, the vast water rights that came with it, and he saw a way to achieve his ambitions. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. She knew her father was a ruthless man, driven by a relentless ambition, but she had never imagined the depths of his manipulation. He needed a way to get rid of Thornton, Rhett continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He couldn't do it himself, not directly. He needed someone to take the blame, someone expendable. His eyes met Maggie's, a flicker of pain and regret in their depths. He framed me, Maggie. He made it look like I stole from him, like I betrayed him. He planted evidence, paid off witnesses he made sure I had to run, to disappear, to become the outlaw he needed me to be. The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Maggie stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of his revelation. Her father, the man she had always known, however cold and distant, had deliberately destroyed Rhett's life, turning him into a fugitive, all for the sake of his own ambition.
Why?
She whispered, her voice trembling. Why would he do that? Rhett's smile was bitter, devoid of any humor. Because with me out of the way, and Thornton conveniently dead soon after, he could step in, offer to help the grieving widow, and eventually marry her, consolidating their lands and water rights.
It was all part of his plan, Maggie.
A plan that included your marriage to Thornton's son. A plan to create a dynasty, built on lies and betrayal. He ran a hand through his hair and looked at Maggie. His eyes were filled with sadness. I did steal something many years ago. After your father banished me, after Elias had passed on, and before your engagement was announced, I snuck in. Not to harm anyone, but to steal a locket. Your mother's. The one you wear now. Maggie's hand flew to her throat, where she found no locket. It was at the church. I took it off for safekeeping. Rhett nodded. I saw you wear it many days on the ranch. I wanted to return it one day, when I could clear my name. But that day never came. The full weight of her father's deception crashed down on her, crushing her with its force. She had been a pawn in his game, a piece to be moved and sacrificed for his own gain. And Rhett, the boy she had once known, the man she had once trusted, had been the victim of her father's ruthless ambition. The tears flowed freely now, tears of anger, grief, and a profound sense of betrayal. She looked at Rhett, his face etched with pain and regret, and saw him in a new light. He was not the outlaw she had been led to believe, but a victim, a man who had been wronged, a man who had lost everything because of her father's greed. I believe you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I always knew there was something wrong with the story my father told. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb wiping away a tear. Thank you, Maggie, he said, his voice soft, filled with a depth of emotion that she had never heard before. That means more than you know. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing red, casting long, dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks. The night was silent, save for the soft whisper of the wind and the occasional cry of a night bird. Maggie felt a profound shift within her, a breaking down of old beliefs, a shattering of illusions. She had been living a lie, a carefully constructed facade that had now crumbled, revealing the ugly truth beneath. And in the midst of that devastation, she found a newfound sense of clarity, a fierce determination to reclaim her life, to break free from the control of her father, to forge her own path. She had trusted Rhett, the outlaw, the ghost of Abilene, and he had not betrayed her. He had, instead, revealed the truth, a truth that had set her free, even as it bound her to him in a shared destiny. Chapter 6. Whispers of a Renegade's Past. The embers glowed like dying stars, mirroring the fading light of the past as Rhett delved deeper into the story of his exile. The night air, cool and crisp, carried the scent of sage and dust, a familiar aroma that both soothed and unsettled Maggie, reminding her of the life she had known and the uncertain future that lay ahead. After your father framed me, Rhett continued, his voice a low murmur that blended with the whisper of the wind, I had nowhere to go. Every hand was turned against me, every town a potential trap. I became a ghost, a shadow, living on the fringes of society, surviving by my wits and my gun. Maggie listened, her heart aching for the boy he had been, the young man robbed of his innocence, forced into a life of hardship and danger. She could only imagine the loneliness, the fear, the constant threat of capture or death that had haunted his every waking moment. I learned to ride with the roughest crowd, he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, a reflection of the life he had been forced to lead. Men who lived outside the law, men who took what they needed, men who answered to no one but themselves. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the distant horizon, as if seeing the ghosts of his past companions. I learned to fight, to shoot, to survive. I did things I'm not proud of, Maggie. Things I had to do to stay alive. A shiver ran down Maggie's spine, a reminder of the dangerous world he inhabited, the violence that had become a part of his life. But she also saw the regret in his eyes, the sorrow that lingered beneath the hardened exterior, the yearning for a different life, a life that had been stolen from him. But I never forgot you, Maggie, he said, his voice softening, his gaze returning to hers. I never forgot the promises we made, the dreams we shared. I always hoped that one day I could clear my name, come back for you, and make things right. His words were a balm to her wounded heart, a confirmation of the feelings she had held buried for so long, the love that had refused to die, despite the years of separation and the cloud of suspicion that had hung over him. I heard about your engagement, he continued, his voice tinged with a hint of bitterness. I knew it was your father's doing, another move in his twisted game. I couldn't let it happen, Maggie. I couldn't let him take you, too. His eyes burned with a fierce intensity, a protective fire that warmed her from the inside out. She realized that his actions, however reckless, had been driven by a love that had endured, a loyalty that had remained unbroken, despite the years of hardship and betrayal. I know I'm not the man you thought I was, he said, his voice laced with a hint of self-deprecation. I'm an outlaw, a renegade, a man with a price on his head. I can't offer you the security, the comfort that Silas Thornton could have. He paused, searching her eyes, his expression vulnerable and uncertain. But I can offer you my loyalty, my protection, my love. If you'll have me, Maggie. If you'll take a chance on a man who has nothing left to lose but you. His words were a plea, a confession, an offer of a different kind of life, a life filled with danger and uncertainty, but also with a passion, a freedom that she had never known. It was a choice, a leap of faith, a decision that would forever alter the course of her destiny. Maggie looked at him, her heart overflowing with a mixture of emotions. Fear, doubt, excitement, and a love that had been rekindled, stronger and more resilient than ever before. She saw the scars of his past, the wounds that had shaped him, but she also saw the strength, the courage, the unwavering loyalty that lay beneath the surface. She reached out, her hand covering his, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was rough, calloused, but warm and reassuring. She felt a connection, a bond that transcended the years, the circumstances, the accusations that had separated them. I already took that chance, Rhett, she said, her voice soft but firm, her eyes meeting his with unwavering conviction. When I said no in that church, I chose you. I chose this life, whatever it may bring. His smile was slow, tentative, but filled with a relief and a gratitude that mirrored her own. He squeezed her hand, his grip tightening, A silent promise of a future together, a future built on trust, loyalty, and a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. The whispers of his past had revealed the truth, and in that truth, she had found not only her freedom but also her destiny. The night held its breath, as if waiting for the dawn of a new, uncertain, but hopeful future. Chapter 7. The Price of Freedom. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky with streaks of pale gold and rose, chasing away the shadows of the night and illuminating the rugged landscape that surrounded them. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of dew-kissed sage and the faint, lingering aroma of the previous night's fire. Maggie awoke to find Rhett already up, tending to the horses, his movements silent and efficient, the actions of a man accustomed to rising before the sun. She stretched, her muscles stiff from the long ride and the hard ground, her body acutely aware of the changes that had taken place in the past 24 hours. She was no longer Magnolia Callahan, the dutiful daughter, the soon-to-be bride of Silas Thornton. She was a woman on the run, riding alongside an outlaw, her future uncertain, her destiny intertwined with a man who had stolen her from her wedding and, in doing so, had given her back her freedom. The price of that freedom, she knew, would be high. Her father would not let her go easily. He would pursue them, relentlessly, driven by a mixture of wounded pride, lost ambition, and the desire to maintain his control. Silas Thornton, too, would be seeking revenge, his honor stained, his carefully laid plans shattered. Rhett returned to the small campsite, his expression grim, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll be looking for us." Maggie nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She knew the dangers that lay ahead, the challenges they would face, but she also felt a sense of exhilaration, a thrill of adventure that she had never experienced before. They ate a quick breakfast of dried beef and water, the meager provisions a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Then, they saddled the horses, Rhett helping Maggie mount, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary, sending a shiver of awareness through her. They rode out, heading west, towards the rugged mountains that loomed on the horizon, a natural barrier that offered both protection and danger. The terrain was rough, the going slow, the horses picking their way carefully through the rocky landscape. As they rode, Rhett pointed out the various landmarks, the hidden trails, the watering holes known only to those who had spent their lives on the open range. He was teaching her, guiding her, sharing his knowledge of the land, preparing her for the challenges that lay ahead. "We need to reach Devil's Pass," he said, his voice low and serious. "It's a narrow canyon, easy to defend, and it leads to the high country, where we can lose ourselves for a while." Maggie nodded, her mind racing. She knew that Devil's Pass was a notorious outlaw hideout, a place of danger and lawlessness, but it was also their best hope for escape, their only chance to evade their pursuers. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down mercilessly, turning the air into a shimmering haze. The landscape became even more rugged, the trails steeper, the canyons deeper. Maggie's body ached, her throat was parched, but she pushed on, determined to keep up with Rhett, to prove herself worthy of the trust he had placed in her. As they approached Devil's Pass, Rhett slowed the horses to a walk, his eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs, alert for any sign of danger. He dismounted, handing Maggie the reins, and drew his revolver. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice tight with urgency. "And keep quiet. I'm going to scout ahead." He disappeared into the narrow canyon, his movements silent and stealthy, his figure blending with the shadows. Maggie waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead and the frantic beat of her own heart. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each moment filled with a growing sense of dread. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, any indication of what was happening in the canyon. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the sound echoing through the narrow passage. Maggie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her heart leaping into her throat. She wanted to call out, to rush into the canyon, but she knew she had to obey Rhett's orders, to stay hidden, to protect herself. More shots followed, a rapid exchange of gunfire, the sounds of a fierce struggle. Maggie closed her eyes, her mind filled with images of Rhett, fighting for his life, fighting for their freedom. She prayed, silently, desperately, for his safety, for their future. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. The silence returned, even more deafening than before, filled with a terrifying uncertainty. Maggie waited, her breath held captive in her lungs, her body trembling with fear. She didn't know what had happened, who had won, who had lost. All she knew was that the price of her freedom had just been paid, in blood and gunfire, and the echo of those shots would forever haunt her dreams. The canyon seemed to swallow the sounds, leaving only a heavy, ominous silence in its wake. Chapter 8. Scars Beneath the Surface. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, each passing second an eternity. Maggie remained frozen, her hand gripping the reins so tightly her knuckles were white, her ears straining for any sound beyond the pounding of her own heart. The sun beat down, relentless and unforgiving, mirroring the burning anxiety that consumed her. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Red emerged from the canyon, his figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight. He was walking slowly, his shoulders slumped, his revolver holstered. Maggie's heart leaped with a mixture of relief and trepidation. He was alive, but something was clearly wrong. As he drew closer, she saw the blood staining his shirt, the grim set of his jaw, the haunted look in his eyes. He had been wounded, and the battle had clearly taken its toll.
Rhett,
she cried, sliding off her horse and rushing towards him. Are you all right? He nodded, his voice strained.
I'm alive.
But they were waiting for us. Thornton's men. He winced as he moved, his hand instinctively going to his side, where a dark stain was spreading across his shirt. Maggie's eyes widened in alarm. You're hurt, she said, her voice trembling. Let me see. He hesitated, then reluctantly allowed her to examine the wound. It was a gunshot wound, a clean entry and exit, but deep and bleeding heavily. Maggie's stomach churned with a mixture of fear and nausea, but she forced herself to remain calm. We need to stop the bleeding, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, and get you somewhere safe. She tore strips of fabric from her petticoat, her hands shaking slightly, and began to clean and bandage the wound. Rhett gritted his teeth, his face pale with pain, but he didn't cry out. He watched her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. You're strong, Maggie, he said, his voice low and raspy. Stronger than you know. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a newfound determination. She had been sheltered, protected, her life carefully orchestrated by others. But now, she was facing a harsh reality, a world of danger and violence, and she was finding a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. We all have scars, Rhett, she said, her voice soft but firm. Some are just more visible than others. She finished bandaging the wound, her hands gentle and efficient. We need to find shelter, she said. Somewhere we can rest, and you can recover. Rhett nodded, his gaze searching the surrounding landscape. There's a cabin, he said, his voice weak. An old trapper's cabin, not far from here. It's hidden, secluded. We might be safe there. He leaned heavily on her as they walked back to the horses, his body trembling with pain and exhaustion. Maggie helped him mount, her heart aching for him, for the suffering he had endured, for the price he had paid for her freedom. They rode slowly, carefully, towards the hidden cabin, the terrain rough and unforgiving. Maggie kept a watchful eye on Rhett, her concern growing with each passing moment. He was losing blood, his strength fading, and she knew they needed to reach shelter soon. The cabin, when they finally found it, was little more than a shack, nestled among a cluster of rocks and trees, almost invisible from the trail. It was small, dilapidated, but it offered a modicum of protection from the elements and, hopefully, from their pursuers. Maggie helped Red inside, easing him onto a rough-hewn bed covered with dusty blankets. He lay there, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow, his face pale and drawn. She built a small fire in the hearth, the flames flickering to life, casting a warm glow on the interior of the cabin. She found a water skin and a few meager supplies, remnants of the cabin's previous occupant. She bathed Rhett's forehead, her touch gentle and soothing, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and tenderness. As she cared for him, she saw the scars that crisscrossed his body, reminders of the hard life he had led, the battles he had fought, the wounds he had endured. These were the scars beneath the surface, the hidden wounds that spoke of a past filled with pain and hardship. And as she looked at him, she realized that her own scars, the invisible wounds of loss and betrayal, were beginning to heal. She had found a strength, a resilience, she hadn't known she possessed. She had found a love, a connection, that transcended the dangers that surrounded them. She had found a purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to survive. And in the quiet solitude of the hidden cabin, surrounded by the scars of the past, she began to glimpse the possibility of a future forged in the crucible of adversity, a future built on trust, loyalty, and a love that had been stolen, but now, finally, reclaimed. The fire crackled, a small beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Chapter 9. A haven in the storm. The cabin, though rustic and weathered, became a sanctuary, a temporary refuge from the storm that raged outside. Days bled into nights, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing patterns of light and shadow that filtered through the small, dusty windows. Maggie tended to Rhett, her touch gentle and unwavering, her presence a constant source of comfort and strength. She cleaned and rebandaged his wound, her initial fear giving way to a focused determination. She brewed herbal teas from the plants Rhett identified, their knowledge of the land complementing each other, a testament to their shared upbringing, albeit now viewed through a different lens. She cooked meager meals from the limited supplies, rationing their food carefully, aware that they were isolated, their resources dwindling. Rhett's strength slowly returned, his body mending, his spirit regaining its resilience. He watched Maggie, his eyes filled with a gratitude that went beyond words, a love that deepened with each passing day. He saw her resourcefulness, her courage, her unwavering commitment to his well-being, and he realized that he had not only rescued her from a life she didn't want, but he had also found a partner, a soulmate, a woman who could stand beside him, facing whatever challenges the future might hold. They talked, sharing stories, memories, dreams, filling the silence of the cabin with the quiet intimacy of two souls reconnecting. Maggie learned more about Rhett's life as an outlaw, the men he had ridden with, the choices he had made, the regrets he carried. She saw the complexity of his character, the layers of pain and resilience that lay beneath the surface, the inherent goodness that had survived despite the hardships he had endured. Rhett, in turn, learned more about Maggie's sheltered upbringing, her stifled dreams, her longing for a life beyond the constraints of her father's ambition. He saw her intelligence, her wit, her quiet strength, and he marveled at the woman she had become, the woman she was still becoming. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, Rhett reached out and took Maggie's hand. His touch was gentle, tentative, a silent question, a hesitant invitation. "Maggie," he said, his voice low and husky, his eyes searching hers. "I know I'm not the man you deserve. I'm a wanted man, an outlaw, with nothing to offer you but a life on the run." He paused, his gaze dropping to their intertwined hands. "But I love you, Maggie. I've loved you since we were kids, riding through the fields, dreaming of a future together. That dream was stolen from us, but maybe, just maybe, we can find a new one. Together." Maggie's heart overflowed with emotion. She had known, deep down, that her feelings for Rhett had never truly died, that they had merely been buried, suppressed, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now, here, in this rustic cabin, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, that love had blossomed anew, stronger and more resilient than ever before. She squeezed his hand, her fingers tightening around his, her eyes meeting his with unwavering conviction. "I love you too, Rhett," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't care about the past, about the labels, about the dangers. I care about you, and I choose you, just as you chose me." He leaned forward, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a gentle exploration. The kiss deepened, a slow, tender expression of their love, a promise of a future together, a future they would build, brick by brick, in the face of adversity. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling, the rain lashing against the cabin walls, but inside, there was a warmth, a peace, a sense of belonging that transcended the dangers that surrounded them. They had found a haven, a temporary sanctuary, in each other's arms, a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. And in that quiet, intimate moment, surrounded by the scars of the past, they dared to dream of a future where they could finally be free, together under a vast, open sky, where love, not fear, would be their guiding star. The fire crackled, a symbol of their enduring love, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Chapter 10. Echoes of Betrayal. The relative peace of the cabin was shattered by the discovery of a faded, leather-bound journal tucked away in a dusty corner. It belonged to the cabin's previous occupant, a trapper named Jedediah, whose life, as chronicled in the brittle pages, echoed with a haunting familiarity, stirring up the ghosts of Rhett's past and revealing a deeper layer of betrayal than Maggie could have imagined. Rhett had been out checking their meager trapline, hoping to supplement their dwindling supplies, leaving Maggie to tend to the fire and organize the cabin. She stumbled upon the journal while searching for kindling, its worn cover intriguing her. As she began to read, Jedediah's words painted a vivid picture of a life lived on the fringes, a life of hardship, resilience, and a deep connection to the land. But it was his accounts of dealings with local ranchers, specifically Thomas Callahan, that sent a chill down Maggie's spine. Jedediah wrote of Callahan's ruthless ambition, his willingness to use and discard anyone who stood in his way, his manipulation of the law, and his relentless pursuit of power and wealth. He detailed a specific incident, a land grab orchestrated by Callahan, where he had framed Jedediah for cattle rustling, forcing him to flee his home, to abandon his livelihood, to become a recluse, hiding in this very cabin. The parallels to Rhett's story were striking, undeniable, and deeply unsettling. Maggie realized that her father's pattern of betrayal went far beyond Rhett, that he had a history of using and discarding people, of manipulating the truth, of building his empire on lies and deceit. When Rhett returned, his face etched with fatigue and the disappointment of empty traps, Maggie showed him the journal. He read it slowly, his expression hardening, his eyes darkening with a mixture of anger and a profound sense of vindication. "I knew it," he said, his voice low and bitter. "I knew he had done this before. I couldn't prove it." He slammed the journal shut, his hand trembling with barely suppressed rage. "He's a snake, Maggie. A cold-blooded, calculating snake. He'll stop at nothing to get what he wants." Maggie reached out, her hand covering his, her touch soothing and reassuring.
"We know the truth now, Rhett," she said.
"That's what matters." But the journal had stirred up more than just anger. It had also rekindled a sense of vulnerability, a reminder of the power her father wielded, the reach of his influence. Rhett felt a renewed sense of urgency, a need to protect Maggie, to get her as far away from her father's grasp as possible. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tight with determination. "We need to get out of this territory, to find somewhere he can't reach us." Maggie nodded, her own fear rekindled by the journal's revelations. She had underestimated her father's ruthlessness, his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his plans. She knew that they were not safe, that their haven was temporary, that the storm was far from over. They began to pack their meager belongings, their movements hurried and efficient. The sense of peace, of intimacy, that had filled the cabin was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of urgency, a heightened awareness of the dangers that surrounded them. As they prepared to leave, Maggie paused, her gaze lingering on the small, dusty cabin that had been their sanctuary. It had been a place of healing, of reconnection, of love rediscovered. But it was also a place of echoes, of reminders of the past, of the betrayals that had shaped their lives. She took one last look around, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. She had found a haven in the storm, but now it was time to face the storm again, to confront the challenges that lay ahead, to fight for their future, a future free from the shadows of the past. As they rode out, leaving the cabin behind, the journal remained, a silent testament to the enduring power of truth, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the echoes of betrayal can eventually lead to justice, to redemption, to a new beginning. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks shrouded in mist, a symbol of the uncertain journey that lay before them. Chapter 11. The Sheriff's Pursuit. The rugged mountain trails offered a temporary respite, a maze of winding paths and hidden canyons where they could lose themselves, at least for a while. But Rhett knew it wouldn't last. Her father's reach was long, his influence extending far beyond Abilene, and he wouldn't give up easily. He would use every resource at his disposal, every connection he had, to track them down. And he had. Sheriff Buckley, a man known for his unwavering loyalty to Thomas Callahan, and a posse of hand-picked men were hot on their trail. Rhett had spotted their dust cloud days ago, a distant but ominous presence that served as a constant reminder of the danger that pursued them. He had pushed them hard, riding through the day and often into the night, seeking the most difficult, least traveled paths, hoping to outdistance their pursuers. But Buckley was a skilled tracker, and the posse was relentless, driven by a mixture of duty, reward money, and perhaps a touch of fear of Thomas Callahan's wrath. Maggie, despite her growing weariness and the constant ache in her muscles, never complained. She rode beside Rhett, her eyes alert, her spirit unbroken. She had adapted to the harsh realities of life on the run, her resilience surprising even herself. She had learned to trust Rhett's instincts, his knowledge of the land, his ability to anticipate their pursuers' moves. One evening, as they camped in a narrow, hidden canyon, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, Rhett spoke of the sheriff. "Buckley's a good man, in his own way," Rhett said, his voice low and thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of their small campfire. "Honest in most things. But he's beholden to your father. Callahan made him, gave him his position, his power. He won't betray that loyalty, no matter what." Maggie nodded, her heart heavy with a mixture of dread and resignation. She knew that Buckley's pursuit was not personal, it was a matter of duty, of obligation, of a debt owed to her father. But that didn't make it any less dangerous. "We can't outrun them forever," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "What will we do?" Rhett reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch reassuring. "We have options," he said. "We can try to lose them in the mountains, find a place to hide, to lie low until they give up. Or we can cross the border into Mexico. It's a dangerous journey, but once we're across, Callahan's law won't reach us." The thought of leaving the country, of abandoning everything she had ever known, was daunting. But the alternative, facing her father's wrath, the prospect of being dragged back to Abilene, forced into a life she didn't want, was even more terrifying. "Mexico," she whispered, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. "It's a long way." Rhett nodded. "It is. But it's a chance. A chance at a new life, a new beginning, a chance to be free." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and determination. "We'll face it together, Maggie. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." She squeezed his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, her heart filled with a love that transcended the fear, the uncertainty, the dangers that surrounded them. She had chosen this path, this life, and she would not waver. As they continued their journey, the presence of the posse became more palpable, a constant threat that hung over them like a dark cloud. They could hear the distant sound of horses' hooves, the occasional shout, the telltale signs of their pursuers closing in. Rhett pushed them even harder, seeking the most treacherous trails, the narrowest canyons, the steepest climbs. He was testing the limits of their endurance, pushing them to the brink, but he knew it was their only chance. One day, as they were traversing a particularly narrow, rocky ledge high above a deep ravine, they heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire, close behind them. The posse had found them. The chase was on. The mountains, once a refuge, had become a battleground, a test of their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to each other. The echo of the shots reverberated through the canyons, a stark reminder of the price of their freedom. Chapter 12. Under a blanket of stars. The gunfire spurred them into a desperate flight, a frantic scramble across treacherous terrain, the posse's shouts and the pounding of hooves echoing behind them. Rhett led the way, his horse navigating the narrow ledge with a sure-footedness born of desperation and experience. Maggie followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on Rhett's back, trusting him implicitly to guide them to safety. They rode for hours, the sun beating down mercilessly, the air thick with dust and the scent of fear. They pushed their horses to their limits, urging them onward, knowing that any hesitation, any misstep, could mean capture or worse. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and red, Rhett finally slowed the horses to a walk. They had reached a small, secluded plateau, hidden from the main trail, a temporary sanctuary offering a brief respite from the relentless pursuit. They dismounted, their legs stiff and aching, their bodies exhausted. The horses were lathered in sweat, their sides heaving, their nostrils flaring. Rhett tended to them first, his movements gentle and reassuring, his concern for their well-being evident. Maggie collapsed onto a nearby rock, her body trembling with exhaustion and the lingering effects of adrenaline. She watched Rhett, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. He was a man of remarkable resilience, of unwavering determination, a man who had faced countless challenges and emerged stronger, more resolute. He returned to her side, his expression grim, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. "We've bought ourselves some time," he said, his voice low and raspy. "But they'll be back. Buckley won't give up." Maggie nodded, her own fear rekindled by his words. She knew that their respite was temporary, that the danger was still present, that the chase was far from over. They ate a meager meal of dried beef and water, the silence between them thick with unspoken anxieties. The vastness of the night sky, a blanket of stars stretching endlessly above them, was both beautiful and terrifying, a reminder of their isolation, their vulnerability. As the darkness deepened, Rhett built a small fire, the flames flickering to life, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rocks. The warmth was welcome, chasing away the chill that had begun to creep into the air. They sat close together, sharing the warmth of the fire, their bodies touching, their hands intertwined. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, but rather a shared space of understanding, of unspoken emotions. "Maggie," Rhett said, his voice soft, his eyes searching hers. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to put you in danger." She reached out, her hand gently cupping his cheek, her touch soothing and reassuring.
"I know," she said.
"You didn't put me in danger, Rhett. You saved me. You gave me a choice, a chance at a life I wanted." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "I'm scared, Maggie," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Scared of failing you, of losing you." She squeezed his hand, her fingers tightening around his. "We'll face it together, Rhett," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with unwavering conviction. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze, his own eyes reflecting the flickering flames of the fire. He leaned forward, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a gentle exploration. The kiss deepened, a slow, tender expression of their love, a promise of a future together, a future they would fight for, no matter the cost. Under the vast, star-studded expanse of the night sky, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, they found solace in each other's arms, a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, more resilient. They were two souls, bound together by fate, by circumstance, by a shared destiny. They were outlaws, fugitives, lovers, partners, facing an uncertain future, but facing it together, their love a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. The fire crackled, a symbol of their enduring bond, a testament to their unwavering commitment to each other. The stars, countless and distant, seemed to watch over them, silent witnesses to their love, their courage, and their resilience. Chapter 13. The Unveiling of Secrets. They managed to evade Buckley and his posse for several more days, navigating the treacherous mountain terrain, their knowledge of the land and Rhett's instincts their only allies. But the constant pressure, the relentless pursuit, was taking its toll. They were running out of supplies, their horses were exhausted, and the strain of constant vigilance was beginning to show. One evening, while camped in a narrow, hidden canyon, a discovery was made that would change the course of their flight and unveil a secret that had been buried for years, a secret that connected Rhett's past to Maggie's present in a way neither of them could have imagined. Maggie, while searching for firewood, stumbled upon a small, almost hidden crevice in the canyon wall. Curiosity piqued, she peered inside, her eyes widening in surprise. It was a small, natural cave, and inside, tucked away in a corner, was a weathered, wooden chest. She called Rhett over, his curiosity matching hers. Together, they managed to pry the chest open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, they found a collection of items: old maps, surveying tools, a few gold coins, and a stack of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed to a man named Jedediah Stone, the same name as the trapper who had owned the cabin they had sheltered in. But these letters were not from family or friends, they were from a lawyer, a man named Silas Thornton Sr., the father of the man Maggie was supposed to marry. Rhett and Maggie exchanged a look of stunned disbelief. They began to read the letters, their contents revealing a conspiracy that went far deeper than they had ever imagined. The letters detailed a plan, orchestrated by Thomas Callahan and Silas Thornton Sr., to acquire vast tracts of land in the territory, land that rightfully belonged to smaller ranchers and homesteaders, including Jedediah Stone. They spoke of bribery, intimidation, manipulation of the law, and even murder. One letter, in particular, caught Rhett's attention. It was dated a few weeks before he had been framed for theft and forced to flee Abilene. In it, Thornton Sr. wrote to Callahan, expressing his concerns about Rhett Slade, referring to him as a potential obstacle to their plans. He suggested that Callahan take care of the problem before it escalated, implying that Rhett's knowledge of their dealings made him a dangerous liability. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. They planned it all along, she whispered. They used you, Rhett, just like Jedediah. They were going to get rid of you, one way or another. Rhett's face was a mask of fury, his hands clenched into fists. He had always suspected that her father was behind his downfall, but to see it confirmed, in black and white, in the words of his co-conspirator, was a devastating blow. But it was also a revelation, a key to unlocking the truth, a weapon they could use to fight back. The letters were proof, irrefutable evidence of Callahan and Thornton's crimes, evidence that could clear Rhett's name and expose their corruption. This changes everything, Maggie, Rhett said, his voice tight with determination. We can't just run anymore. We have to fight. We have to expose them, bring them to justice. Maggie nodded, her own fear replaced by a newfound sense of purpose, a fierce determination to see justice served. She had been a victim of her father's manipulation, but she would not be a victim any longer. She would stand with Rhett, fight alongside him, and reclaim their lives, their futures. The discovery of the letters had transformed their flight into a mission, their escape into a quest for justice. They were no longer just running, they were pursuing, seeking to expose the truth, to bring down the men who had destroyed their lives, to reclaim their honor and their freedom. The secrets hidden in the canyon wall had been unveiled, and the repercussions would ripple far beyond the rugged mountains, reaching into the heart of Abilene, shaking the foundations of power and corruption that had held sway for so long. The echoes of betrayal had led them to a path of confrontation, a path that would test their courage, their resilience, and their love. Chapter 14. Blood on the Horizon. The decision to turn and fight, to confront Callahan and expose his crimes, was a turning point, a shift from defense to offense. But it was also a dangerous gamble, a decision that would put them directly in the path of their pursuers, increasing the risk of capture, or worse. Rhett knew they needed a plan, a strategy to maximize their chances of success. They couldn't simply ride into Abilene and present the letters to the authorities. Callahan's influence extended far and wide, and he would likely have them arrested or killed before they could even speak. They needed allies, people they could trust, people who were not beholden to Callahan, people who would be willing to help them expose the truth. Rhett had a few contacts, men he had ridden with in the past, men who had their own reasons to distrust Callahan and Thornton. He decided to seek them out, to enlist their aid, to form a coalition of resistance against the powerful ranchers who had controlled the territory for so long. It was a risky move, putting his trust in men who lived on the fringes of the law, but it was their only hope. They left the mountains, heading back towards Abilene, but taking a circuitous route, avoiding the main trails, using their knowledge of the land to evade detection. They rode under the cover of darkness, resting during the day, their senses on high alert, constantly watching for any sign of pursuit. As they neared the territory controlled by Callahan and Thornton, the tension grew, palpable and suffocating. They knew they were entering enemy territory, that every encounter, every conversation, could be a trap. One evening, as they were camped in a secluded grove of trees, a sudden, unexpected attack shattered the uneasy peace. A group of men, hired guns working for Callahan, ambushed them, their bullets ripping through the night, their shouts echoing through the trees. Rhett reacted instantly, drawing his revolver and returning fire, his movements fluid and practiced. Maggie, though terrified, grabbed a rifle from their supplies, her hands trembling but her aim surprisingly steady. The firefight was brief but brutal, a chaotic exchange of gunfire and shouts, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. Rhett, despite his skill and experience, was outnumbered, outgunned. A bullet grazed his arm. Another tore through his hat, inches from his head. He fought on, fiercely, protectively, shielding Maggie from the attackers. But then, a shot rang out, and Rhett cried out in pain, his body jerking backward, his revolver falling from his hand. Maggie screamed, her heart leaping into her throat. She saw Rhett fall, his body crumpling to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. She rushed to his side, her fear overwhelming, her mind racing.
"Rhett,"
she cried, her voice choked with emotion.
"No."
"Please, no." She knelt beside him, her hands frantically searching for the wound, her tears blurring her vision. He was alive, but barely, his breathing shallow, his pulse weak. The attackers were closing in, their footsteps approaching, their voices triumphant. Maggie knew they were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. She had no chance of fighting them off, of saving Rhett, of escaping. She looked down at Rhett, his face pale and drawn, his eyes flickering open, a faint glimmer of recognition in their depths. He reached out, his hand weakly grasping hers, his touch a lifeline, a silent promise. "Run, Maggie," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his breath ragged. "Save yourself." Tears streamed down Maggie's face, her heart breaking. She couldn't leave him. She wouldn't leave him. She would stay with him, fight with him, die with him, if necessary. But then, as the attackers closed in, a new sound erupted, a thunder of hooves, a chorus of shouts, a wave of gunfire that shifted the balance of power. Rhett's allies, the men he had sought out, had arrived, just in time, turning the tide of the battle, their arrival a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. The blood on the horizon was not just Rhett's, it was the dawn of a reckoning. Chapter 15. A choice between two worlds. The arrival of Rhett's allies was a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouts, a whirlwind of dust and fury that transformed the ambush into a full-scale battle. The hired guns, caught off guard and outnumbered, were quickly overwhelmed, their attack turning into a desperate retreat. Maggie, amidst the chaos, remained focused on Rhett, her hands pressed against his wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. He was losing consciousness, his breathing shallow and ragged, his pulse weakening. She feared the worst, her heart a knot of dread and despair. The fighting subsided, the sounds of gunfire replaced by the groans of the wounded and the shouts of Rhett's men. A tall, grizzled man, his face etched with the scars of countless battles, knelt beside her. It was Jake, Rhett's closest confidant, a man known for his loyalty and his unwavering courage. "How is he?" Jake asked, his voice gruff, but filled with concern. Maggie shook her head, her voice choked with emotion.
"He's bad, Jake. He needs help fast."
Jake assessed the situation, his eyes sharp and calculating. "We need to get him out of here," he said. "To somewhere safe, somewhere we can tend to his wounds." They carefully lifted Rhett, his body limp and unresponsive, and carried him to a nearby wagon, hastily commandeered from the fleeing attackers. They laid him gently on a bed of blankets, Maggie cradling his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his pale face. Jake took the reins, urging the horses forward, driving the wagon along a rough, hidden trail, heading towards a secret hideout, a place known only to a select few. As they rode, Maggie tended to Rhett, her hands trembling, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. She cleaned his wound, bandaged it as best she could, and whispered words of comfort, of encouragement, even though she didn't know if he could hear her. The journey was long and arduous, the wagon jolting and swaying, each bump sending a fresh wave of pain through Rhett's body. Maggie never left his side, holding his hand, stroking his hair, praying for him to survive. They finally reached the hideout, a small, secluded cabin nestled deep within a remote canyon, a place far from the reach of Callahan and his men. They carried Rhett inside, laying him on a rough-hewn bed, the cabin dimly lit by a single flickering lantern. Jake's men, a rough but loyal bunch, gathered around, their faces etched with concern. They had all heard of Rhett's courage, his defiance of Callahan, and they respected him, admired him, even loved him. A woman, Sarah, emerged from the back room of the cabin, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. She was a healer, a woman skilled in the use of herbs and remedies, a woman who had lived on the fringes of society, providing care to those who had nowhere else to turn. She examined Rhett's wound, her touch gentle and experienced. "He's lost a lot of blood," she said, her voice grave. "But the bullet passed clean through. He's strong. He has a chance." Hope flickered in Maggie's heart, a fragile ember in the darkness of her despair. She watched Sarah work, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound, applying herbal poultices, stitching the torn flesh. Hours passed, long and agonizing, filled with a tense silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the occasional moan from Rhett. Maggie never left his side, holding his hand, whispering words of love, of encouragement, willing him to live. As dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of pale gold and rose, Rhett's breathing stabilized, his pulse strengthening, his fever breaking. He opened his eyes, his gaze weak but focused, his eyes finding Maggie's. He managed a weak smile and whispered, "Maggie?" She managed a smile back, tears of joy and relief falling down. "I'm here, my love." The men were discussing their next move. A rider interrupted them, breathless. "Callahan knows. He's gathered every man he could, and they're moving toward Abilene. Said he would burn it down if he had to get Slade, and..." The writer hesitated. And Miss Callahan. Maggie felt Rhett's hand tighten around her own. She knew she could still choose. She could claim this was all Rhett's doing and get back to her father's fold. But she would lose everything. Maggie looked at Rhett and knew she had already made her choice long ago, standing in that church. Chapter 16. The Weight of a Stolen Heart. The news of Callahan's impending attack on Abilene sent a shockwave through the small cabin, the fragile peace shattered by the looming threat. The men, hardened outlaws and rebels, exchanged uneasy glances, their faces grim, their hands instinctively moving towards their weapons. Maggie, despite her relief at Rhett's improving condition, felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Her father was a ruthless man, driven by a relentless ambition, and he would stop at nothing to achieve his goals, even if it meant destroying the town he had helped build, the people he had once claimed to protect. She knew that she was the catalyst, the reason for his wrath. She had defied him, rejected his plans, chosen a life with an outlaw, and now, the consequences of her actions were about to rain down upon the innocent people of Abilene. The weight of her stolen heart, the burden of her choices, pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She had sought freedom, love, a life of her own choosing, but the price, it seemed, was far greater than she had ever imagined. Rhett, still weak but conscious, sensed her distress. He reached out, his hand weakly grasping hers, his touch a lifeline, a silent reassurance. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice raspy, but filled with concern. "Don't blame yourself. This isn't your fault. It's his. He's the one who chose this path, this violence." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. He was right, of course. Her father was the one responsible for his actions, for his cruelty, for his relentless pursuit of power. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had played a part, that her defiance had unleashed a storm that threatened to consume everything she held dear. Jake, ever the pragmatist, interrupted their quiet exchange. "We need a plan," he said, his voice gruff but determined. "We can't let Callahan destroy Abilene. We have to stop him." The men began to discuss strategies, their voices low and urgent, their faces illuminated by the flickering lantern light. They debated various options, weighing the risks and benefits of each, their experience and instincts guiding their deliberations. Maggie listened, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She knew that they couldn't simply ride into Abilene and confront Callahan head-on. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and they would be playing into his hands. She had an idea, a risky plan, but one that might just work. It would require courage, deception, and a willingness to face her father, to confront the man who had shaped her life, the man who had become her enemy. "I have a plan," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "But it's dangerous. And it requires me to go back to Abilene. Alone." The men stared at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Rhett, his eyes widening in alarm, tried to sit up, his body protesting the movement. "No, Maggie," he said, his voice weak but firm. "It's too dangerous. I won't let you." She reached out, her hand gently caressing his cheek, her touch soothing and reassuring. "I have to, Rhett," she said. "It's the only way. I know my father. I know how he thinks. I might be able to reason with him, to stop him before it's too late." She knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she couldn't stand idly by while her father destroyed everything she held dear. She had to try, even if it meant facing him alone, even if it meant risking her own life. The men debated her plan, arguing the pros and cons, their voices rising and falling in the dimly lit cabin. Rhett, despite his weakened state, vehemently opposed it, his fear for her safety overriding his strategic instincts. But Maggie was resolute, her determination unwavering. She had made her choice, chosen her path, and she would not back down. Not now, not ever. She had a stolen heart to protect and a future to fight for. Chapter 17. Crossroads of Destiny. The decision hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that filled the small cabin. Maggie stood firm, her resolve unwavering, despite Rhett's protests and the men's concerns. She knew the risks, the dangers, but she also knew that she was the only one who could possibly reach her father, the only one who might be able to avert the impending disaster. Jake, after a long silence, finally spoke, his voice gruff but respectful.
"She's right," he said.
"It's a long shot, but it's our best chance. We can't ride into Abilene guns blazing, we'd be slaughtered. Maggie knows her father, knows how he thinks. She might be able to get through to him." Rhett, still weak and pale, struggled to sit up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and frustration. "No," he said, his voice strained. "It's too dangerous. I won't let you risk your life, Maggie. Not for me, not for Abilene." She knelt beside him, her hand gently caressing his cheek, her touch soothing and reassuring. "I'm not doing it for you, Rhett," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm doing it for myself, for my future, for the people of Abilene. I have to try. I have to at least try." She looked into his eyes, her own eyes filled with a love that transcended the fear, the uncertainty, the dangers that surrounded them. "I love you, Rhett," she said, "and I'll come back to you. I promise." He searched her eyes, his own gaze filled with a reluctant acceptance, a grudging admiration for her courage, her determination. He knew he couldn't stop her, that her mind was made up, that she was a woman of her own making, a woman who would not be controlled, not by her father, not by anyone. He reached out, his hand weakly grasping hers, his touch a silent farewell, a silent promise of his own. "Be careful, Maggie," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "And come back to me." The men, despite their reservations, agreed to support her plan. They would provide a distraction, drawing Callahan's forces away from Abilene, giving Maggie a chance to reach her father, to confront him, to plead with him to stop the madness. Maggie changed into simple, nondescript clothing, discarding the remnants of her riding attire, trying to blend in, to become just another face in the crowd. She took a small, concealed pistol, a gift from Sarah, the healer, a silent promise of protection. She rode out alone, under the cover of darkness, heading towards Abilene, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and determination. She was riding towards a crossroads, a pivotal moment in her life, a confrontation that would determine her future, her destiny. She knew that she might be walking into a trap, that her father might not listen, that she might be sacrificing herself for nothing. But she also knew that she had to try, that she had to stand up for what she believed in, that she had to fight for the life she had chosen, the love she had found. As she rode, she thought of Rhett, his weak smile, his whispered words, his unwavering love. He was her strength, her inspiration, her reason to fight. She would come back to him. She promised herself. She would survive this. She would overcome this, and they would build a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. The lights of Abilene appeared on the horizon, a faint glimmer in the darkness, a beacon of hope and danger. Maggie rode on, her heart filled with a mixture of trepidation and resolve, her destiny awaiting her in the town she had once called home, the town she was now determined to save. The crossroads of her life lay ahead, and she would face it head-on, with courage, with determination, and with the unwavering love of a stolen heart. Chapter 18. Fires of Redemption. Abilene was a tinderbox, the air thick with tension and fear. Rumors of Callahan's impending attack had spread like wildfire, the townsfolk bracing themselves for the inevitable, their faces etched with a mixture of dread and defiance. Some had fled, seeking refuge in the surrounding hills, but most had stayed, determined to defend their homes, their livelihoods, their town. Maggie, arriving under the cover of darkness, slipped into town unnoticed, blending in with the anxious crowds. She moved through the familiar streets, her heart aching with a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow. She saw the faces of people she had known her entire life, neighbors, shopkeepers, friends, their expressions reflecting the fear that gripped the town. She made her way to her childhood home, the large, imposing house that had once been her sanctuary, now a symbol of her father's power and tyranny. The house was heavily guarded, armed men patrolling the perimeter, their faces grim, their eyes watchful. Maggie knew she couldn't simply walk up to the front door. She would be arrested or shot before she could even speak. She needed a way to get inside, to reach her father, to confront him without alerting his guards. She remembered a secret passage, a hidden tunnel that led from the garden to the cellar, a passage she and Elias had used as children, playing games of hide and seek. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. She slipped into the garden, moving stealthily through the shadows, avoiding the watchful eyes of the guards. She found the entrance to the tunnel, concealed behind a thicket of overgrown bushes, its wooden door almost hidden from view. She pried the door open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest, and slipped inside, the darkness enveloping her, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. She navigated the tunnel, her hands brushing against the cold, damp stone walls, her heart pounding in her chest. She emerged into the cellar, the darkness even more profound, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of the house above. She crept up the stairs, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, her senses on high alert. She reached the main floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear voices, her father's booming tones and the murmurs of his men, coming from the study, his usual place of business. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation, her hand gripping the small pistol concealed in her pocket. She opened the door, her entrance sudden and unexpected, her figure silhouetted against the dimly lit hallway. The conversation stopped abruptly, the men turning to face her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Her father, seated behind his large, imposing desk, stared at her, his eyes widening in shock, his face hardening with a mixture of fury and something else. Was it fear? "Magnolia," he said, his voice a low growl, his hand instinctively moving towards the pistol on his desk. "What are you doing here?" She stepped into the room, her gaze unwavering, her voice surprisingly steady. "I came to stop you, father," she said. "To stop this madness. To save Abilene." He scoffed, his expression derisive. You have no power here, Magnolia. You are a traitor, a disgrace, siding with that outlaw." "He's not an outlaw, father," she said, her voice rising in anger. "You made him that way. You framed him. You used him. You destroyed his life. Just like you've destroyed so many others." She pulled out the letters, the evidence of his crimes, the proof of his betrayal. "I know the truth, father," she said. "I know everything. And I won't let you get away with it any longer." He stared at the letters, his face paling, his expression shifting from anger to a flicker of fear. He knew he was cornered, exposed, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before him. But then, his expression hardened again, his eyes narrowing with a ruthless determination. "You think those letters matter?" He sneered. "I am Thomas Callahan. I control this town, this territory. No one will believe you, a disgraced woman, siding with a criminal." He reached for his pistol, his intention clear. Maggie reacted instantly, drawing her own weapon, her hand surprisingly steady, her aim true. "Don't do it, father," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but firm. "Don't make me do this." The room was filled with a tense silence, the standoff between father and daughter, a tragic confrontation, a culmination of years of betrayal and deception. The fires of redemption burned bright, a cleansing flame that threatened to consume everything in its path. But the outcome remained uncertain, hanging in the balance, a testament to the choices they had made, the paths they had chosen. Outside, the sounds of the impending battle grew closer, a stark reminder of the stakes, the consequences of their actions. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. The standoff stretched, taut and agonizing, the air thick with unspoken emotions, with years of resentment, betrayal, and a fractured bond between father and daughter. Maggie held her pistol steady, her finger on the trigger, her gaze unwavering, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to shoot him. She didn't want to kill her own father, but she would not hesitate to defend herself, to protect the people of Abilene, to stop his reign of terror. Thomas Callahan stared at his daughter, his own pistol aimed at her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He saw the defiance in her eyes, the determination in her stance, the unwavering resolve that mirrored his own. He saw the woman she had become, the woman he had tried to control, the woman who had dared to defy him, to choose her own path. He lowered his pistol, slowly, reluctantly, his hand trembling slightly. He knew he was beaten, cornered, exposed. He had underestimated his daughter, her courage, her strength, her unwavering commitment to what she believed was right. "You would have shot me," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and a grudging respect. Maggie lowered her own pistol, her hand still shaking, her heart still pounding. "I would have done what I had to do, Father," she said, her voice firm but filled with a profound sadness.
Just like you would have.
He looked at her, his expression softening slightly, a flicker of regret, perhaps even remorse, crossing his features. He had built his empire on lies, on deceit, on the suffering of others. He had sacrificed everything, including his own daughter's happiness, for the sake of his ambition. And now, it was all crumbling around him. "It's over, Father," Maggie said, her voice gentle but firm.
Call off your men.
"Stop this madness. It's not too late to make amends, to do what's right." He hesitated, his pride warring with his sense of defeat, his ambition clashing with the flicker of conscience that Maggie's words had ignited. The sounds of the approaching battle, the distant shouts and gunfire, grew closer, a stark reminder of the impending chaos, the consequences of his actions. Finally, after a long, agonizing silence, he nodded, his head bowed in defeat. "All right," he said, his voice raspy, his spirit broken. "I'll call them off." He turned to his men, his voice regaining some of its former authority, but tinged with a weariness, a resignation that was palpable. "Stand down," he commanded. "It's over. We're leaving." The men, stunned by his sudden change of heart, hesitated, their faces reflecting their confusion, their disbelief. But they obeyed, reluctantly lowering their weapons, their expressions a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Maggie watched, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and a profound sadness. She had won. She had stopped her father. She had saved Abilene, but the victory felt hollow, bittersweet. The damage had been done, the wounds inflicted, the scars would remain. She lowered her pistol completely, her hand falling to her side, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She had faced her father, the man who had shaped her life, the man who had become her enemy, and she had emerged victorious, but at a great cost. As her father's men began to disperse, retreating from the house, from Abilene, a new sound emerged, a chorus of cheers, a wave of triumphant shouts that echoed through the town. Rhett's allies, Jake and his men, had engaged Callahan's forces outside of town, drawing them away, distracting them, allowing Maggie to achieve her goal. And then, she saw him, riding through the streets of Abilene, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun, his face etched with relief and a love that transcended all the pain, all the suffering, all the challenges they had faced.
Rhett.
He was alive, he was here, and he had come back to her, just as he had promised. The reckoning had come, and in its wake, a new dawn was breaking, a future uncertain, but filled with hope, with the promise of redemption, and with the unwavering love of two souls who had found each other amidst the chaos and the fire. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The sight of Rhett riding through the streets of Abilene, his figure a beacon of hope against the backdrop of a town saved from destruction, filled Maggie's heart with a joy so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. She ran towards him, her steps light and unburdened, the weight of her father's tyranny lifted from her shoulders. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, despite the lingering effects of his wound. He reached out, his arms enfolding her in a tight embrace, his touch a reassurance, a confirmation that they had made it, that they had survived, that they were together. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, his breath warm against her ear.
You did it. You saved them.
"You saved us." She leaned back, her hands framing his face, her eyes searching his, her heart overflowing with love. "We did it, Rhett," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and triumph. Together. They stood there, in the middle of the street, oblivious to the cheering crowds, the grateful townsfolk, the retreating figures of her father's men. They were lost in each other's eyes, in the shared moment of victory, in the promise of a future finally free from the shadows of the past. But the final confrontation was not with guns or violence, but with the lingering echoes of betrayal, with the wounds that needed healing, with the choices that had shaped their lives. As the initial euphoria subsided, Maggie knew she had to face her father one last time. Not with anger or resentment, but with a sense of closure, a need to understand, to forgive, to move on. She found him in his study, the room where their standoff had taken place, the room that had witnessed the crumbling of his empire. He was sitting alone, his head in his hands, his figure slumped in defeat, his spirit broken. She approached him slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silent room. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame, regret, and a profound sadness. "Maggie," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to say." She sat down opposite him, her gaze gentle but firm. "You don't have to say anything, father," she said. "It's over. It's done." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking forgiveness, understanding, a glimmer of hope in the wreckage of his life. I did terrible things, Magnolia," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I justified them. I rationalized them, but I know they were wrong. I lost myself. I lost my way." She reached out, her hand covering his, her touch a gesture of compassion, of forgiveness. "I know, father," she said, "but it's not too late to change. It's not too late to make amends, to find a different path." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope, a spark of redemption in the ashes of his defeat. He had lost his power, his wealth, his empire, but he had gained something else, something far more valuable, a chance to reconnect with his daughter, a chance to find peace, a chance to start anew. The final confrontation was not a battle, but a reconciliation, a healing of wounds, a closing of a chapter, a beginning of a new one. Maggie had faced her father, not with anger or violence, but with compassion and understanding, with a forgiveness that was both a gift and a release. As she left the house, leaving her father behind, she felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace, a sense of freedom. She had confronted the past, she had overcome the challenges, she had emerged victorious, not in a battle of guns, but in a battle of hearts. Rhett was waiting for her outside, his eyes filled with love and admiration. He reached out, his hand enfolding hers, his touch a promise of a future together, a future they would build, brick by brick, on a foundation of trust, loyalty, and an unwavering love. They rode out of Abilene, together, leaving behind the shadows of the past, heading towards a new horizon, a new beginning, a new life. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow on the vast, open plains, a symbol of hope, of redemption, of the enduring power of love to conquer all. They rode side by side, their hearts intertwined, their destinies forever linked, their stolen hearts finally free. The vast horizon stretched out before them, holding all the uncertainties and promises of a new life. Epilogue. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons, the slow, steady rhythm of life on the open range. Maggie and Rhett built a life together, far from Abilene, far from the shadows of her father's past. They established a small ranch, nestled in a secluded valley, a haven of peace and tranquility, a testament to their love, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to each other. Rhett's name was eventually cleared, the evidence of Callahan and Thornton's crimes brought to light, their empire crumbling, their legacy tarnished. Justice, though delayed, had finally prevailed. Rhett was no longer an outlaw, a fugitive, but a respected rancher, a man of integrity, a man who had found redemption and a second chance. Maggie blossomed, her spirit soaring, her heart filled with a joy she had never known before. She embraced the life she had chosen, the freedom she had fought for, the love she had found. She became a skilled horsewoman, a capable rancher, a loving partner, her strength and resilience surprising even herself. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up strong and free under the vast, open sky, surrounded by the love of their parents, the legacy of their courage, the promise of their future. Thomas Callahan, a broken man, lived out his days in quiet solitude, his empire gone, his reputation ruined, his only solace the occasional visits from his daughter, a testament to her forgiving nature, her unwavering compassion. He never fully redeemed himself, but he found a measure of peace in the knowledge that his daughter had found happiness, that she had escaped the darkness of his ambition, that she had built a life of her own choosing. As the years turned into decades, Maggie and Rhett often sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, purple, and red, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with a love that had endured, a love that had conquered all. They remembered the past, the challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, the choices they had made. They remembered the stolen moments, the whispered promises, the unwavering loyalty that had bound them together. They had found their haven, their sanctuary, their forever. They had built a life, a family, a legacy, on a foundation of trust, resilience, and an enduring love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. Their stolen hearts, once filled with fear and uncertainty, were now overflowing with a love that was boundless, a love that was timeless, a love that would last forever. The vast, open sky, the endless horizon, the quiet whisper of the wind, all bore witness to their story, a testament to the enduring power of love, of forgiveness, of redemption, a story of two souls who had found each other amidst the chaos and the fire and had built a life, a love, a legacy that would last for generations to come. And as they held each other close, they knew their journey had been worth every hardship, every sacrifice, for they had found their true home in each other's arms. The end.